Hey, good morning, everybody. This is Mr. Rader here for a EP World History review session. This will help prepare us for our next live session where I'll answer any questions that you have based on the lecture material that I go through over the next 10 to 15 minutes. So in front of us is the AP curriculum that will be tested on the exam this year, Units 1 through Unit 6. And this lecture will review Unit 1, the Global Tapestry, and Unit 2, Networks of Exchange, from the period circa 1200 to the period 1450 CE, where we'll look at state formation and networks of exchange using Jerry Bentley's framework for our analysis of cross-cultural interactions, specifically looking at the role of long-distance trade, mass migrations, and campaigns of imperial expansion, using some PowerPoint slides from past Saturday tutoring review sessions under the old AP exam. All right, so let's get started. When we're looking at this period, there are a couple of key patterns and trends to keep in mind. Trade, war, diplomacy, and international organizations under what was becoming a pretty increasingly interconnected and interdependent global economy based in the Afro-Eurasia region, looking at the Silk Roads, the Indian Ocean, and the Trans-Saharan caravans. So when we look at this period, we're going to be looking at the rise of the Mongol Empire, the Pax Mongolia, which is this is succeeding decades after the Mongols had established their empire, had converted to Islam, and had begun to integrate the existing networks into their larger empire. When we think about regional history in our AP World History course, we should be mindful that different regions experience these events very differently. So, for example, when we think of Mesoamerica, Latin America, the Caribbean, they are distinct regions. Likewise, when we look at the African continent, the experience of North Africa is very different from West Africa. When we look at the rise of Timbuktu, for example, as contrast to Bantu migrations into Central, East, and Southern Africa. Okay, so when we're thinking of this time period, we're really looking at the connections between continuity and change over time as it relates to the Afro-Eurasian basin. So some of the major changes, the empires of the Romans, the Han, the Gupta, they've gone into collapse and decline. New political units have arisen, decentralized systems such as feudalism in Western Europe and in Japan, religious-based empires, nomadic migrations, the beginnings, particularly by 1450, of the Seljuk Turks, who eventually become the Ottoman Empire, and the Mongolian Empire. Some clear key continuity. So when you're taking the AP exam, although the older classical civilizations, the Romans, the Greeks, the Assyrians, the Mesopotamians, Persians, Macedonians, etc., won't be tested on AP World Modern as it was under the old AP exam, you can still discuss the existing trade network. So the Silk Roads, yes, they were built by the Romans on the western terminus and the Han Chinese on the eastern terminus, but they continue to be used during this period in world history. The trade routes continue to be important in global commerce and in cultural diffusion, particularly when we look at the rise and spread of Islam. Okay, so the third major pattern, the effects of technology, economics, and demographics. So remember from your participation in government classes with seniors, we're looking at indicators such as the age of a group of people, the ethnicity, the gender of the people, where they live, so on and so forth in terms of demographics. Some major technological changes at the time, the compass, improved shipbuilding technology, the caravels, the stirrups in terms of mobile cavalry units, and most noticeably gunpowder at the end of the period. Remember, it's created by the Chinese in the middle of the 10th century. It's used in limited means in terms of like rocket-propelled arrows. It really begins to be used extensively by the Ottomans with cannons, particularly when they conquer the Byzantine Empire. By 1453, they take over Constantinople, rename it Istanbul. Okay, So, movements of peoples are greatly altering world history, including the spread of epidemic diseases. The most notable being the bubonic plague caused by the bacteria Yersinia pestis, which nowadays can be treated with simple antibiotics, and there are still a handful of people that get it, even in the United States, each year. But back in the 14th century, in the 1350s, it was a death sentence for many. Okay, so some systems of social structure and gender structure. Again, the images kind of speak to a lot of things that are going on. There's a major role of patriarchy, roles of religion having a major control on these societies, clear imbalances in gender relations. Women are being considered inferior, subjugated to cold practices, including foot binding that you can see in the image on the left. Okay, the developments of culture, intellectual, religious developments, and interactions among within societies. We see the rise of Christendom in the West, the role of Dar al-Islam in the East, and we're looking at religion in many ways as a unifying force throughout these societies, from the Holy Roman Empire in the West to the rise of the Islamic caliphates. The ones that are going to be tested on now would really only be the Abbasids. Those are the ones you need to be aware of. They're the ones who helped to build the House of Wisdom in Baghdad. And they're the ones who create the most extensive empire in the Islamic world. The Umayyads are in this PowerPoint. You'll see them. If they're tested at all, it could be in reference as part of the DBQ when we look at Cordoba in southern Spain, Andalusia, and the knowledge workshops that were existing at the time. Okay, so some changes in the functions and structures of states. We do see centralization of empires. The Byzantines in the eastern half of the Roman Empire, they themselves always called themselves Romans. They never considered themselves the Byzantines. That was a later European creation. The Arab Caliphates and the Tang Dynasty and the Song Dynasty in China, building off the successful models of the past. Okay, so when we're thinking about the Tang and Song dynasties, they reintroduced the Confucian bureaucracy, the civil service exams that were created under and really expanded upon the Han dynasty in the second and third centuries BCE. In terms of new empires, we're seeing the rise of China, Byzantium, and the Islamic caliphates. The Tang dynasty extends control over Tibet and Korea. Eventually, the Song lose the mandate of heaven to the Mongols. In 1279, the Mongols established the Yuan dynasty. The Yuan dynasty will last a little under 100 years until I believe 1368. And again, this is just me improvising here. And I believe 1368 is when the Ming dynasty reasserts its control. They reclaim the mandate of heaven and they come into power. And this is where, in our class, when we're looking at Unit 2, specifically looking at networks of exchange, this is when we see the third Ming Emperor, the Yongle Emperor, creating the treasure fleets, Zheng He, and the establishment of really Chinese dominance in the Indian Ocean. This is why we see questions such as on the SAQ part of the exam of a giraffe in the court of the Ming Dynasty, the Ming Emperor. The giraffes are native to Africa, but they travel from East Africa by ship to China in exchange for various products: jade, porcelain, tea, and weapons. Okay, so in terms of looking at the Tang Dynasty and the Song Dynasty, these two maps speak to their relative extents. We can see the Tang Dynasty by the 8th century is covering northern southern China, tributary states in modern-day Korea, and the Song Dynasty mostly in the eastern part of China. Some things to keep in mind in the Tang Dynasty, we see state-sponsored anti-Buddhist backlash developing Neo-Confucianism, gunpowder really being developed later on, and the compass aiding maritime navigation. The Grand Canal is one of their major infrastructure projects, and it really is used to help the population grow in the north. They're using champa rice in the south, which is a fast-growing rice-based product that can be used to really feed a very large and growing population. So in terms of understanding the golden age of the Tang Dynasty, we see porcelain, we see landscape art, we see the junk ships, We see movable type centuries before the Gutenberg press of the 1450s, the rudimentary compass. These were the fire arrows that I was mentioning earlier, early versions of rockets and gunpowder type technology. So, basic political developments. So, in terms of the Islamic empires, we see the Abbasid dynasty really controlling the largest components. In Cordoba, we see the Umayyad caliphates. The Umayyads will not be tested on this exam, but they are kind of the precursor. They're the earlier dynasty, and they retain control of southern Spain until the Reconquista concludes 1492. So, in terms of Umayyad policies, we're going to skip this for now. It won't be tested on the new AP exam. Same with this one. So the Abbasid Caliphate, it may be useful just to be aware of the House of Wisdom in terms of its relative importance, not only to scholasticism in the 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries, but also even just as importantly thinking about how the cultural legacy of the Greek Empire under the Alexander of Macedon and the Roman Empire, Latin and Greek gets translated into Arabic and then gets translated back into the secular languages of Europe. Okay, so if we're thinking about this golden age of Islam, we're really looking at the contributions in mathematics and science. For example, some of the very first hospitals on the planet were built and constructed in Baghdad and other Arab centers, Damascus as well. And we also see the origins of the very first cataract surgeries as well. And in the slide, you can also see algebra was also created during this time period. Okay, Abbasid art and architecture. We see the great mosque at Samarra, paintings, calligraphy, etc. Some political developments that are taking place at this time. So the Byzantine Empire, I'm going to skip over. The only thing I'm going to really make mention of is that the Byzantines build on the codified laws of the Romans. We have the Justinian law codes. We see the use of Greek as their official language, and we see a schism in the Catholic Church between essentially the Catholic West with Pope based in Rome, and then another Pope based in Constantinople. We see the big schisms, and I believe it's around 1025 where the Catholic Church essentially splits into two. I'm going to skip the Justinian material again. Interesting in the sense that he does reconquer parts of the Roman Empire in terms of different regions, but again, this does not need to be known for the new AP exam. Let's see. I'm going to skip this as well. Okay, so feudalism in the West will be tested and could possibly appear on the DBQ. So in terms of EBD, evidence beyond the documents, or the general context that you could put into an introduction, we see decentralized states. We see feudalism, essentially where every single lord would control their own medieval manor. And you would have essentially obligation, different types of relationships between the nobility, the knights, and the serfs. The Catholic Church gives the king the right to rule. Serfdom is going to be a pretty big practice as well. Okay, so this is the hierarchy that you're probably familiar with, even going back into the 9th grade, thinking about the social hierarchy of the system. In Japan, they do have a feudalized system as well. It is different from the European system by far. They have a central figure or a shogun who reigns as a military general over the people of Japan. By contrast, though, it is not a power given to the leader by a religious official per se, like a pope, but the reigning dynasty of Japan, which had been in power since the 7th century, I believe around 636, and they're still the current empire, the ruling family in power today in Japan. Okay, so some cultural and economic developments to keep in mind when we think about the Heian period, which was based in Kyoto. And in terms of thinking about Japan during its feudal period, they do mix some elements of syncretic beliefs, Buddhism coming from India into China into Japan, and thinking about the role of women in Japanese society. So the three big nomadic empires were the Vikings in northern Europe, Scandinavia, the Turks who become the Ottoman Empire, and the Mongolians. So the Seljuk Turks, in terms of considering their power over time, they are a pastoral nomadic group. They were originally hired by Muslim leaders as mercenaries. They do convert as well to Islam. They take over the Abbasid Caliphate by 1055. They invade Baghdad. The Mongols, they are the largest empire in world history. They take advantage of the stirrup, which today looks like the saddle, in terms of allowing their archers to be in a very effective fighting force using cavalry units. They become very powerful, really, until gunpowder empires supplant them, looking at most particularly the Ottoman Empire. Okay, in terms of thinking about the Mongols, by the time Genghis Khan dies, he splits his empire into administrative states, different khanates. Some of these khanates, for example, in northern India, will eventually become the Mughal Empire. We'll see the rise of the Ottoman Empire, etc. So, some things to kind of keep in mind. We're thinking about the Mongols. We want to think about the various offshoots of the Mongolian Empire. We want to see what happened in China under the Yuan dynasty. In terms of considering the Mongol peace, they are united under Mongol rule. This is where we see another golden age appearing at the time. And it becomes the idea thinking of barbarians as a positive force in human history as opposed to a negative force in human history. Mongol decline, some things to keep in mind, just like many empires, when they go into decline, they didn't last that long. They were bad at administering the empire. Many empires, if you get too big to administer, controlling the hinterland from the capital is a very difficult thing to be able to do. So, other things to consider in terms of understanding Afro-Eurasia, we see the rise of Ghana, Mali, Timbuktu, Mansa Musa, West African kingdoms, thinking of the role of the Hajj as it relates to the Islamic culture, and in terms of its ability to promote cross-cultural interactions through long-distance migrations. Christianity in North and East Africa, thinking particularly the role of Ethiopia as a biblical center of Christianity, and the Coptic tradition in Egypt. East African city-states, this is really looking at the role of the Indian Ocean as far as facilitating the rise of these city-states in this time period, thinking about the mix between Arabic language and the Swahili language of the Bantu peoples. Looking at the role of the Crusaders, the Crusades will have a pretty large role in, at least in terms of understanding modern European history. So, thinking of the Crusades themselves, we're really looking at a multiple set of Crusades. The most famous is the First Crusade, 1095, 1096, 1097, and the Second Crusade under Salah ad-Din, a century later. Really looking at what was happening here in terms of the larger crusade periods. Some results of the Crusades. So this is really the beginnings of the globalized economy. This is where we begin to see the rise of the guild system. This is where we begin to see cultural diffusion between the Christian and Muslim worlds, the ending of the Dark Ages in Europe, and the beginnings of larger periods of exploration around the planet. So when we're thinking about impacts of interactions in the High Middle Ages, 1000 to 1450 CE, a couple of things to really speak to. Increased trade, stimulating the growth of commercial sites in the heart of Europe, the Hanseatic leagues that begin to form in the North Sea, and the role of Florence and Venice in terms of being integrated into a larger Mediterranean community, the rise of the Renaissance, so on and so forth. As I mentioned before, looking at the role of guilds as early union systems, as trade organizations, and as ways to create greater security for workers, master craftsmen in the European continent. So we got medieval guilds, different types of guilds that exist, from bootmakers to stonemasons to carpenters, metal workers, etc. Hanseatic League isn't really going to be tested on the exam. I mentioned it in passing. There's just some details for you to keep in mind about the Hanseatic League. Economic recovery in Europe. We spoke in class before we went remote about Henry the Navigator in terms of the foundations of really the Atlantic exploration. and thinking about how we go trace a path from Henry, the navigator, to Vasco da Gama, who sails around the Cape of Good Hope and into the Indian Ocean, and then at the eventual openings of the Western Hemisphere. At the end of the 15th century, looking at what's happening by 1492, which will be covered in a different lecture, different set of units for the AP exam. Looking at the story of disease, the role of plague, and how plague actually traveled from China to the West in the middle of the 14th century, and some of the consequences that happened to various demographics on the planet in Eurasia. Some missionary campaigns, things to kind of keep in mind if we're thinking about cross-cultural interactions and we're thinking about how migration can contribute to cultural diffusion. These are some examples looking at the role of Buddhism. This one looks at the role of Christianity in the same general time period. I'm going to skip through that. Ibn Battuta would be a nice reference for like EBD or for context, just thinking about explorers in Afro-Eurasia in terms of a figure who had way more experience in terms of travel than Marco Polo, who's more famous in the West, is Ibn Battuta. This is a map that actually compares Polo and Ibn Battuta. Marco Polo is in red, mostly just traversing the Silk Road. Ibn Battuta, you can see trans-Saharan caravans, parts of the Indian Ocean, and the Silk Road. Looking at some impacts of cross-cultural exchange, we see a whole variety of cultural diffusion, also the spreading of plants and animals in terms of the crops themselves. Thinking about, again, spoke about it before, the role of gunpowder going from fire arrows to cannons. We see the role of the Mongols. We see the role of reaching the European powers and the Ottoman Empire as well. So recovery and Renaissance in Asia and Europe by 1450, some things to consider: the role of the Jesuits, the Yongle, again, that was the third emperor of the Ming Dynasty, promoting Chinese traditions, printing materials. The Ming Empire is lasting until 1644 when the Qing Dynasty takes over. So this is kind of speaking to what I was talking about earlier, the Chinese junkerships, looking at essentially the rise of Ming naval supremacy for a short period of time. And this is the main areas where they essentially established different trading zones in the Indian Ocean area, and the creation of tributary states. Again, this one looks specifically at Zheng He. Thinking about the Italian Renaissance and the role of humanism, I don't think this will be tested extensively on the AP exam, but it could be used for EBD, evidence beyond the documents, or thinking about broader context, using the words like Renaissance or humanism, looking at Florence or the role of any of the Renaissance painters. Let's see, political developments. This I mentioned before, the reconquest of Granada by 1492, thinking about what was happening, taking Spain back in the hands of the Catholics, and dispersing the Umayyad Caliphate. Mayan civilization, again, this one could be tested on the AP exam, even though the time period is before 1200, thinking about borrowing from Olmec traditions and creating an empire of their own, really looking at the height of their power by the 7th and 8th centuries. The Aztecs, thinking about, this is really more for a different lecture, thinking more about pre-Columbian civilizations. The Incas, again, similar, just parts of South America. All right, I'm going to stop here. And just to show you a couple of AP prompt practices from the old exam, things to consider. Again, the LEQ is not on the AP exam, but things that could appear on the exam. Looking at continuity and change in terms of trade, commerce, and the Indian Ocean from 650 to 1750. Looking at the political and economic effects of Mongol rule on different regions. Periodization is no longer on the exam. Thinking about similarities and differences, so that would be talking about comparison, in this case, biological, commercial, and cultural exchange. Alrighty, everybody, we're going to stop here for our review lesson, And we'll check in during our live session on Wednesday. I'll answer any questions that you might have as it relates to this content material. I hope everybody has a nice day.